Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It is 1 o'clock. We are going to have an on-time departure this morning. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a breakout session called Signals in the Noise, AI, OSINT, and Operational Advantage. I'm John Doyen. I'm the Executive Vice President of INSA. I want to welcome you here to this session. A couple of things. We will be using question cards today to ask questions. So they're on your seats. If you have a question, please write it legibly and keep it short. And we'll have folks going around collecting the question cards. Also, I wanted to give a big shout out and thank you to our breakout session sponsor for this afternoon. It is 10X National Security. So thanks to them for their generous support. And now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. We have with us Dr. Dennis Eger, who's the Senior OSINT Advisor in the U.S. Army. We also have Richard Smith, Champion for Open Source Enterprise at CIA. We have Melisa Stivaletti, who's the OSINT Director at Guidehouse, and we have Sean Batir, Principal Tech Lead for Frontier AI, Quantum and Robotics at AWS. And moderating today is Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg, the President of INSA.
Thank you,
Over
John.
to you, Suzanne.
Thank you. So I would just like to ask each of you a 2-minute response or less question, just as a scene setter, to kind of get your perspective that you're bringing to the conversation today. And the question here is, how is the sheer scale and velocity of open source information, much of it really machine generated, changed the tradecraft and mission during the past year? Let's start with you, Melisa.
Okay, great. It's really great to be here, even if a little last minute.
Appreciate that.
Absolutely. The tradecraft for open source intelligence is rapidly evolving, and I am so pleased to be part of an agile group of people who are willing to upskill themselves and learn AI and lean in on the massive amount of data that we're dealing with, right? And then we have such amazing partners, I think, across the board to work with. That's industry, it's international partners, it's across the ecosystem of open source. What I would say is maybe just a quick vignette is the most downloaded tradecraft piece that we have right now, I think, is on prompt engineering. So our folks, and I say our as in like the OSINTers, right? The OSINT community, they are leaning in on prompt engineering and understanding how to really leverage the tools that are emerging to deal with this influx of data that we've seen over the years.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we probably shouldn't just constrain it to OSINT, because if for those of you in the room paying attention, I think the fall of 2022 was one of those moments in history that probably many of us are going to reflect back on. I remember being in my office and basically messaging one of my peers in the organization, and I said, when OpenAI released ChatGPT, I told them this is going to change how humans interface with information in a way that probably none of us expected to happen as quickly as it happened. And so, you know, over the last, not just the last year, but certainly in our organization, our tradecraft is fundamentally transformed as a result of using AI specifically to help generate OSINT. It's doing it at a speed and scale that humans couldn't possibly do it. Now, that said, there are a host of problems that are associated with that, because effectively what we did was we traded one problem where we had a bunch of human resources to generate products, and now we've got machines, but we don't have the skill sets that we need and the people to go use those things. And so, you know, the tradecraft is evolving rapidly, and I think this is a good thing, and I think we're going to find out that we're going to be able to get to information in a way that we never could before.
Yeah, I think just to pile onto that a little bit, when I think about the amount of information that is out there, kind of where we were and where we're going, I go back to when I was a young analyst in an agency 30 years ago, and my job every day was to come in and look at the stack of paper reports that were beside my desk. And I'm going through them one by one, doing everything I'm supposed to do. And everybody said, don't worry, the next thing that's coming on board is this thing called a hard drive. And we're going to put lots of information on there, and it's going to make things more efficient. And so that came along, and we just took on more information. And then it was, what's the next thing, right? And so now we're at this point where it's like, cloud, we're going to put everything in the cloud, just means more information. And so when you do that, we have to really, really change the way we do business to look at AI, what's that going to look like on top of it, because there's too much information. An analyst today is not going to be able to get through all of that or siphon through it. And so, the tech companies that are out here today, they're all on the leading edge of being able to do that. But AI is allowing us to do that. But the tradecraft has to change, and it has, the way you go about getting information. I think part of the issue is there is still not the trust amongst a large population of people for the AI itself or where the data is coming from to inform it. And so there's a little hesitation on if I do things like, Rich is saying where, maybe from an efficiency perspective, AI is generating some reporting from the information or the data quickly. What does that mean? Can I trust it? Right? And so your tradecraft shifts from now humans doing it completely to AI doing some to human in the loop. What do I have to do to verify? And I think that's kind of what this transformation that has happened over the next 10 to 20 years is going to be.
And what needs to change to establish that trust? Is it more in the human?
I think that's a good question. I think everybody wants to understand. I was in a couple AI courses recently, and everybody wants to understand the black box in the background. And it's understanding where's that information coming in, how is it being trained, how is it being leveraged, right? And so one of the things we talk about all the time is let's take our own reporting or data that we know that is trusted and true. Let's put the model on top of it and see what it does. But I think until people really understand the mechanics of, as they call it, the black box in the background, it's going to be challenging.
Sean?
Yeah, I guess to close out, so, I'm Sean Batir. I just moved over to AWS about 2 months ago. So previous to that, for the past 5 years, I've actually worked doing the OSINT mission in support of targeting workflows. And so in that role, I had the sort of rare opportunity to see how tradecraft actually evolves as you go out to the forward line. And when we think about the deployment of generative AI, I think something for the audience to be tracking, especially if you're with a private company or you're also one of our government agencies, is that we have a way of doing things. There's a tradecraft, there's a schoolhouse where we learn how to do the art of analysis. Many of you might know alternative competing hypothesis as one core example. But then there's also modification of the knowledge base at your specific location. The way that we do tradecraft at one combatant command would be different from another, just a little bit. And even though they all ultimately flow to the same direction, the throughput of the processing was heavily dependent on having that whip-smart analyst who was with you. And I think what we're seeing now, especially with the deployment of some of these Gen AI models, and I've seen firsthand, is that when we are able to crystallize that intuition, when you have those experts who've been there for 30 years and they begin interacting with the models, if successfully implemented by the host agency, we can then begin accelerating and shortening the timeline to learning as new units come forward. And so happy to dive a little bit more further, especially with some of my colleagues here. It's an exciting mission set, and I think there's only room to grow.
Great.
Yeah.
So the title of this panel is Signals in the Noise, and we had the opportunity to talk a week or two ago doing our prep work for this panel, and that some of the noise is some of the negativity, right? And so we talked about just getting that out front and then moving on with the good of all of this. So Richard, this question is for you, and then others can chime in if you want to, but as we all know, adversaries can now flood the entosphere with highly realistic AI-generated content. How do we adapt OSINT to operate effectively in this polluted environment that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, this is probably one of my pet peeves, because this is one of the areas where I believe, my personal belief here, and I'm only going to say my personal belief, I believe we are spending way too much time focusing on misinformation. That's not our number one problem, frankly. It's not in the top 5 of the things that I've got to worry about in solving that. So I'm not saying it's not a problem, because it is a problem. It's just not a today problem. I think we've got bigger things to worry about. I mentioned earlier, we're trading essentially humans manually doing work for machines doing work, and then humans, essentially, reviewing that work and letting it go. The reality is we don't have the skill sets to do that, and that's going to take time to train people to get there. As Dennis said, we were actually having a conversation earlier where a large part of the population just is not comfortable being uncomfortable. And the reality is that's the space that we're in with AI. We have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. We are not going to understand what's happening in the black box because most of the people building them don't even understand it. And so we have to get to a point where we learn, we trust, we're going to validate, we're going to use that. But focusing on necessarily the misinformation is just not at the top of my list today.
Great. Anybody else want to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, I think, I would agree that, we're talking with Rich about, top 5 priorities. I'm thinking in my head, and certainly things that I can't say in this environment, right? But there are, I have some other challenges that are much, much more important to me, really for how I'm going to do tactical OSINT or OSINT at the tactical level, and really thinking through things like how are we in the Army at the tactical level going to fight OSINT, and what does that look like as a profession? Like those things are really at the top of my list. That's not to say that misinformation, disinformation, those things are not problematic. They've always been there. I just think they're amplified more now because of the different types of avenues from which they can do it, social media or whatnot, and the algorithms behind it that kind of amplifies it. So I think it's probably a little more prevalent today that folks see it as opposed to, what it used to be. And look, that's what the information environment does. As we have more information coming in, more technology, more sources to it, there's a greater ability for folks to inject into it. I do think, though, that if we're going to solve that problem, and I have looked at it, right? Like, what does that look like for my analysts? Because I truly need my folks spending less time trying to figure out if something is misinformation, disinformation, fake, whatever it is, and I need to have them spending more time collecting and being efficient. So if I have a technology solution, and I know some are out there already, we've looked at them, but that do that for me on the front end, and that's kind of what this AI thing does, and you got to be able to trust it, then I think that's kind of the direction that we got to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Melisa.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit of an alternate view there. I do think that mis and disinformation are really prevalent and evolving in a way that is outside of even the open source intelligence domain, right? Like, this is more of a America and global problem where we need to provide literacy, in digital literacy, in a really advanced way to our youth so that they can start to identify what is real and what is true. And I think understanding what is authentic does matter. What I will say is, as far as it relates back to OSINT, yeah, it is a problem. It's probably not in my top 5 either, to your point, Rich. However, the vendors that we have seen come into the picture in the last 3 years on identifying mis and disinformation and deepfakes have been truly impressive. So some of you are out there and you have those technologies, and I think our ability to integrate those technologies into the OSINT ecosystem so that it helps the analysts, very important. And what I'd also notice sometimes, it doesn't matter if it's fake or not. What matters is what narrative is getting out there and how is it impacting the problem at hand. And that's it. And we don't need to be distracted chasing down what's true or not true, but dealing with what's in front of us.
Hence the noise. So, Sean, this next question is for you. With AI producing both authentic insights and deceptive fabrications, how do analysts ensure their decision makers are seeing reality, not an adversary's narrative? So, from your perspective, 2 months in at AWS, and then in your previous role?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we have observed, at least, I'll start backwards and then go from 2025 to 20. So now today, there is a flood of new AI-generated content. The benefit, though, and some of you in the room have probably experienced this, for the most part, if you actually put your attention to reading the AI-generated text, we can still identify if it is made by a machine. There's something about like the language structure where it feels inorganic, and I know that it's more of a feeling than it can be quantified verbally, but we have noticed that actually that rare element of human intuition comes into the workflow at the end of the day. That said, there are also algorithms that can quantify that, and then they can actually predict, like this was a highly predictable next token, right? So like there's both my technical answer, and then there's also that like intuitive tradecraft answer, and I think there's a marriage of both. If we zoom back towards like maybe 2020 to 2022, I think one of the key domains where we saw adversaries show like adversarial AI or like types of like artificial intelligence would be in the context of having fake targets, right? There would be particular battlefields that we'd be looking at or particular zones of interest, and there would be an object that could be a plausible like kinetic risk, but then it was actually just a blow-up balloon. And you can't always tell that from satellite imagery if geospatial intelligence is your like core function. There's also the other type of intelligence, signals intelligence, right? Where it could have possibly just been a false flag. And the invariant, and why I go just a little bit into the detail, is that that takes time and energy from your limited workforce. So when a commander or when whoever is leading that sort of fusion cell is saying, hey, take a look at these signals that we're seeing in the battle space, without the tools that we have developed in the past 3 years, it was much more of a burden then to take a look at those distractors than it is now. But the issue is that now we also need to have that leadership, the people who actually dictate how tradecraft is executed, to be educated just enough to know that they can actually have a machine-based agent take a quick look at this intelligence and sort of do that initial triage. So with that, I pass it over to the rest of my team.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about that and about what Melissa was saying about identifying, because I think when we talk AI and technology and kind of where we're going, is identifying that something is misinformation, disinformation, fake, whatever it is, like that's only like the front end of the equation, right? And the back end of the equation is, where did it come from? Who started it? Who were they connected to? What does that diagram look like so that I can better target, right? And so I read some research out of MIT about a year ago and some things that they were working on, a really great capability, but to do just that, right? So something was identified, but they were able to trace it back to who put it on the internet, where they put it, and then spiraled out to who believed it, who didn't believe it. So now I can target and I can inject. So that's what AI is going to do for us, and it's going to make it quick, right. Like very efficient. Just like that, you put it in. Now I have my diagram, and I can see where it is and I know how to affect it. So identifying it, great, but I got to get to the other side of that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to preface this question, Melissa, that you're not a Hill staffer, right?
No.
But could you just talk broadly about the draft HIPSI IAA?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who maybe aren't following niche subcommittees on the Hill, I would just like to make sure that we're all tracking that recently the HIPSI created an OSINT subcommittee, the first ever subcommittee dedicated to an intelligence discipline, as far as I know. There may be someone out here who can tell me I'm wrong, but I think that's right. And just the fact that that committee was formed is a signal, right, to the community that we need to get our actions in line with policy, and this is important, and there's a lot to be done. The recent language that came out in the draft IAA from section 601 to 610, so it starts around page 85 or 83. So you can just skip to that. Everybody look it up, read it. It is in draft, but it's really exciting because there's really this whole section that talks about the evolution of open source intelligence. It provides a draft new definition of open source intelligence, along with definitions of publicly available information, commercially available information, and poises some ideas for how to better harness both commercially and publicly available information. So how to do that, I think on some of your chairs, there's these little flyers that talks about the upcoming ICDC.
Oh, what a shameless plug.
Hey,
no, I'm kidding.
You know, I gotta, Brian is gonna Vanna White for us. So we're trying new things in the community. And again, I say we as in like the OSINT community, not my corporate hat or any of my clients, but really the community for open source intelligence. And this is one of the things, right? We are definitely trying to break status quo. We're trying to figure out how to do better at getting commercially available and publicly available information to the people who need it in the best package possible. And Dennis and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. You know, there is a difference between any function in, you know, the national security complex using commercially or publicly available information and open source intelligence. And one of the things that IAA kind of gets at is by really leveraging those definitions, and it talks a little bit about that coordination with the CDOs and working with the CDOs really closely to make sure that we are cross-talking, we're having, you know, a lot of transparency. There's a lot of conversation out there about duplication of data in the open source domain, and I gotta tell you, that's not my main thing. I don't know how you guys, you know, feel about it. I think increased transparency is helpful, especially when it comes to our data acquisition strategies, and we're certainly working on it. And we'll see what ICDC does. We'll see what the draft IAA, if it makes it out of draft, and you know, if it gets across the finish line, what that will do. But what I will say is the fact that there's a big chunk in the IAA focused on open source intelligence definitely gets me excited to really push the INT forward.
So, you know, with this OSINT movement and the vast numbers of students and early to mid-career professionals we have in attendance, I would like for each of you all, if you want to comment on the future workforce in OSINT and how they prepare for a career in this track.
Yeah.
Well, let me jump in. I want to really quickly with the, I just want to hit the HPSI thing really quickly because I think it's super important. Those of us that have been working in this space for a while, you know, to see that a subcommittee in the HPSI was created for OSINT the first time ever was probably the biggest news for us that we ever received, quite honestly. And there's someone sitting in the audience today, and I won't call them out, I promise, that was my biggest champion on the Hill 7 years ago as we were trying to get OSINT moving. And she was the force that kept it going on the HPSI. And so to actually see it 7 years later, like this is a big deal for us. It was 7 years for us to get to this point. Yeah. And for, you know, even a draft IAA to come out with a section completely on OSINT, I think speaks to the importance that individuals are finally placing on it from a professional sense. And so, you know, we have taken a lot of steps in the Army to professionalize our OSINT workforce. We focused on everything from, you know, training to capabilities to technology. I mean, we really reinvented everything that we did. And from where we were 7 years ago, in a short 3.5 years, publishing a strategy, building in capabilities, revolutionizing the way we did training, to really professionalize what it is. I just, you know, this momentum, we just got to make sure that we don't take a step back. But I speak to a lot of university students about, as I travel around, about what they want to do in the government. And so there are a lot of them that are very interested in this space. And so I think you'll see, and this is, I always talk about this when I go around, we must have industry, academia, and government working together. Yes. All three. We have to. We can't. Yeah. It is the three-legged stool. One of them goes away, it's problematic. And so there are a lot of institutions out there, universities, that are doing some incredible things with intelligence studies programs, OSINT programs. They are building the next generation of OSINT collectors, and they want to come into the government and work. And so I think it's up to us to figure out how we're going to provide opportunities for them, because this is where they want to be.
Yeah. I'm curious, just in the audience today, I know that there's some academia at least out represented in the vendor sort of booth space. Who is it here is from academia? Yeah, I'm so glad that we've got that mix here. It's fantastic. And I mean, Dennis, you've done so much work to bring academia into the Army OSINT ecosystem. It's been really impressive to watch.
It's been a dedicated effort. Like I made it a very conscious decision, and thanks to Emily, who was my innovations person, quite honestly, that we talked through all this stuff. We went through a very deliberate effort for about 18 months engaging academia across the country. We went everywhere. And what they're doing, not just intelligence studies, but in OSINT, is just absolutely mind-blowing. And they are doing things that, it might take me forever to get my OSINT collectors today to do. They are just intuitively doing it. That's how good they are.
I think what's going to be important for all of us is to help encourage those students to come into the field, right? To remember that you can be part of the intelligence community and OSINT can be your discipline. You don't have to, enter because you think you can be James Bond, running around your organization rich. But really coming in knowing that OSINT is its own dedicated, really, really complex and rewarding discipline, and getting them. So if you're here and you're a student, come to OSINT, we want you.
I think this dovetails into something, though, that the three of us were talking about earlier that I think is really, really important, is that if we want that to happen, we have to make sure that OSINT is absolutely a professional discipline like the other INTs, and not seen as an add-on. If we continue to talk about OSINT in the narrative that it's an add-on, that anyone can do it, don't worry about it, we've got a problem. And it will be hard to convince anybody, especially those young university students, to come on board and do this professionally if they don't see a future, if we don't actually say it's an INT. For us, we consider it, we've all talked about this, we consider it the INT of first resort. And in the Army, we say it is the foundational intelligence discipline. This is where we start. And we've built it out as a profession based off of that. But if we continue a narrative around PAI and CAI are OSINT, and anybody can do it, we've got a problem.
Yeah.
Because it takes away the professional aspect of it, the tradecraft of it, the fact that you need those individuals to do it. So I know we had discussed that. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to get to your question, because this has been something that we've been having kind of existential conversations internally about ourselves. And for those of you in the audience with STEM degrees, I don't want to denigrate you, but what I will tell you is our experience over the last 2 years in implementing GAI is the best users of the AI have actually been the liberal arts majors. And so, those, I'm not trying to denigrate anyone here. I'm just giving you a simple observation. And part of that is because if you get back to kind of the skills that you need for this, and we've touched on this before, the technology is changing the way that we interface with information, but you still need critical thinking skills to be able to look at the information that's there and make an assertion, make an evaluation of what's there. Over the last 2.5 years, what we've discovered for the AI has basically been able to answer almost every question that we've applied to it. Where it couldn't answer the question, it was because of one of two problems. Either we didn't ask the question correctly, or back to the data sharing one, we didn't have enough data to give it context. And so the skill sets for people in the future, I think we're going to need those people who have sleuthing skills, who still do have language skills, who have critical thinking skills. We're going to still need the STEM skills, but there isn't going to be, I think, as much a heavy influence on that in the future.
Yeah, to directly answer the question as well, the other like hidden skill set that I think people think will be covered by Gen AI, but actually it makes you more valuable if you know this skill, it's a foreign language.
Yep.
I know it sounds super basic, but we need people in the community who know all of those like main 5 target languages as well as the more low resource obscure ones. And even though Gen AI can do automated translation, understanding that context is pretty critical. I mean, I thought it was mind-blowing that on one of my last, before I came to AWS, when I was with another government agency, I was requested to meet with an audience that spoke heavily Mandarin Chinese. Literally no one else in the delegation spoke Chinese. So like, what does that say about our capabilities, right? Like, we need to care more about understanding what other countries, how they structure language, what are some of the hidden subtexts, and then also how can we actually communicate in real time outside just English.
Awesome. So speaking of folks entering the career field, we've got a couple of INSA graduate student interns circling around collecting your question cards, and they're all looking for jobs in the intelligence community. So please hand your question cards to our amazing INSA interns, and they'll get them up to me. This next question is for you, Sean, though. Where are we making real progress in cross-agency OSINT, and where are policy classifications or technology gaps keeping us from operating in this enterprise?
Yeah, I love this, and I think it sounds like both of you have equities as well here. So I was in a strange place because if some of you are familiar, I worked on the MAVEN program, which was the DoD's sort of like primary effort to deliver AI to the warfighter. Now, one of the ints that came into that system was also OSINT, and I fully agree with you. You know, Dennis brought up the point, like, we don't treat this as a serious int. The consequence of it not being treated as a serious int is that it becomes heavily personality dependent. And so I alluded to that in my like initial 2-minute introduction, where like if you happen to be at a command with a forward-leaning commander, then he would promote people to experiment with it. But then I would like fly halfway around the world, and then they would just be like, oh, that's a joke. Like, we have like more reliable sources. Like, that's weak, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm biased to it too, because I think there's so much hidden potential in it. And I think if we're on this stage, it's because I've seen it basically save lives and also minimize damage to US forces. And I think that is a key step. Getting this through HPSI, the way this works for those of you who are like, not to be too pedantic, but like, if that money gets authorized, then that can flow through first the Directorate of National Intelligence, on the Title 50 side, right? And then from there, it can then flow to the 3-letter agencies on their respective mission sets. And each one has a house. On the flip side, and I'll maybe pass this over to you after I finish this side of the conversation, there's also Title 10, which stands for Military Intelligence Priorities. All of this you can Google. This is all like publicly disclosed, but it's obscure and really dense to read. So you might also just want to feed it into an LLM. but a lot of the money that we worked with, at least when I worked on the program, was heavily Title 10. What that means is that it needs to pass through another office in the DoD, known as the Secretary for Defense on Intelligence and Security. That means that only specifically things known as combat support agencies can support that, as well as some of that money sometimes goes to the intelligence components of the services, such as the Army. And among those agencies, right, I think that the top 3 that, like, again, a quick Google search can like help you discover, NGA like is sort of the GEOINT functional manager, NSA is a SIGINT functional manager, and then like those are the 2 main functional managers, at least for those 2 respective ints. Where was the one for OSINT, right? And I think there was always this open debate about whether or not it belonged to one agency or another agency. And so, to close out, I think we laid the groundwork by having like a good pathway forward for like funding to flow in fiscal year 2026. Now, what comes next is, can we demonstrate mission workflow integration, right? Like, what are the existing missions, and can we now deliver that with the resources that we have?
That was very well said.
Anybody else have anything to add?
Well, I'll just hit collaboration quickly, and I won't get into the policies, and I certainly won't talk budget. You can go ahead and talk the budget process. I'll leave that alone. Not because there's problems with it or anything like that. I mean, it's about, for me, I budget aside, I got to look at solutioning and I got to look at the future. But from a collaboration perspective, I think that over the past few years, we've had some individuals in positions, key OSINT positions, that have really moved OSINT to the forefront, and without them, I don't think we would be where we are, quite honestly. But there is just an incredible collaboration going on between all of the agencies, whether it's the OSE folks, whether it's OSIC, us and the services, the rest of the IC, just incredible collaboration on where can we find advantages or opportunities for us to work together on something, which again, when you get after budgeting, then we're talking about reducing cost, right? So, we all share, some form of cost in it, but it's less for all of us, and then we all take advantage of it. And I think as we look at this, and even as we go into the future, we have to take advantage of that even more. But I do think the collaboration that's happening now that, quite honestly, when I came into this job 4 years ago, didn't. And it took some very key people to be put into some very key positions. Look, I think the argument for 7 years, the argument of should there be an agency over top of OSINT like the other ones, I think that's going to be a debate that will go on for a while. My personal views, I don't think are relevant, quite honestly. But I do think that we do have to find ways, and I think the IA put it out there, we do have to find better ways to standardize things, collaborate better, pay once, we all take advantage of it, and I think that's kind of the direction we're all moving.
Mm-hmm. So along the vein of collaboration, how can the U.S. and our allies coordinate OSINT in a real-time effort to counter adversary disinformation?
I mean, we're doing it to an extent. We have some stuff going on where we have incorporated, where we've done some major OSINT things together, partnered with our allies and partners. So we're already moving in that direction, and I've actually taken steps to, some specific folks, allies and partners that are doing some OSINT things, to reach out, have discussions with them about what they're doing, and actually turn them on to technologies or things that we might all be able to take advantage of. But one of the biggest things that we've done, we've incorporated them from a governance perspective into a lot of the stuff that we do, because they're doing some amazing work too. And I think, if we want to talk about multi-domain operations, and we want to talk about allies and partners engaged in those operations and how we're going to move forward, we've got to do it in this space as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I'd also note around disinformation, I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier with the deepfake discussion. We are seeing that OSINT over and over and over again is where tech adoption is happening first, where AI is happening first. So we're going to be able to continue to address this if we stay kind of on that bleeding edge. And I'd really like to highlight Rich here to my right, because this is such a great example of how OSINT is not just the int of first resort, it's the int that's the first mover, right? So when it's much easier for us to adopt in the open source space new technologies. And when I think about, when generative AI kind of showed up and rocked all of our worlds in some way. I mean, you guys are using ChatGPT to plan your vacations now, right? Yeah, right, exactly. If you're not, try it, it's great. But imagine saying that you were gonna do that 3 years ago even. No, it wasn't even in our brains. It was in his brain, and Rich was able to use the open source domain to be the first one to bring generative AI into the IC, full stop. And I mean, I just want to foot stomp that, because it was very impressive. And so the problem is now is we have a really high bar. So I'm not the moderator, but I want to know from Rich, what's next? Sorry, Susie.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about that probably with another question. But I think to your question, and Dennis touched on this, the way that we're going to combat that is we're going to have to do exactly what Dennis said. We have got to come together I'll go back to what I said earlier. If we can't answer questions, it's because we don't have the data. And if we don't have the data, it's because we're not smart enough or willing enough to share it. And that's what we've got to get to. We have got to solve that problem.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you bring that up, Rich. So allies and partners. You would think that in 2025, to send a file to my counterpart at one of our allied countries on the work systems that we use, I could just send him the file. Absolutely not.
Nope.
The current reality that we have is there's often a crazy disclosure process. It comes with the intelligence community, and I think I'm not saying for us to just go rogue and ignore that. I think we have to definitely still have those guardrails in place, but a lot of it can be machine automated. And I think in this year, especially now having moved over to the private sector, I can collaborate with our international colleagues so easily, and the technology safeguards are in place to make sure that required leaks do not occur. And so I think that we have so much potential. You were mentioning, Dennis, that three-legged stool of academia, of commercial, and government. Well, academia and commercial are already able to share key information with our international partners. A lot of the best research I've seen has been a tight collaboration. I think the call to action would be when we think about navigating business processes at within the intelligence community, there needs to be a push for modernizing and allowing data sharing across different boundaries. I think to not understanding Pressar here, the high level is that we need the tech substrate to enable and empower data sharing at scale. Because right now, our manual processes limit us to something like 5 documents an hour. I mean, I'm being a little hyperbolic there, but I think we have the technology, and so let's tighten it up. And then maybe zooming out a little bit more strategically, in terms of working with our allies and partners, especially let's just zoom into just Five Eye, and then let's talk about NATO. With Five Eye, right, we are of course a strong alliance post World War II. And each one has its specific geographic expertise. What can we do? Well, if they already have their geographic expertise, then let's not boil the ocean, right? We should be bringing in their respective regional strengths. For example, Australia has a much more acute understanding of what is occurring in APAC. They're also in the same time zone as APAC, right? And so there are ways for us to collaborate more closely and think about that problem set. Shift to NATO, there are very unique sensitivities of all of those partner countries. But one of the powers that you get is, even though they have slightly different incentives at play, that is an exciting experiment for us to think about what it looks like for what happens when we aggregate unclassified information from each of our partner nations and see what new insights we can derive. Because too often, and I think I've seen this, the US has driven a lot of that effort, but now that we've shifted into a new era, I think it is actually quite exciting. I was out there, right, in European Command when some of our policies had changed in terms of what our funding profiles could and would look like for US support to NATO. And what we're seeing is that NATO is actually beginning to improve their own capability to natively host, to natively innovate. And I think we are living in exciting times, is the best way I can say that. Yeah.
Indeed.
Sean, to get at one of your points, I think one of the things that leads to, we have to be very careful in this space, and I talk about it all the time, not to overclassify open source intelligence. I mean, it is inherently unclassified, right? That does not mean that there are things that are not classified based on the intelligence requirements you're trying to answer. I get that. But if we want to enable that sharing to the level that we need to, we have to be very careful on how we're classifying things and to be able to get it to what level, because clearly all of our allies and partners don't operate on the same kinds of systems that we do. And even within our own service, we all don't have the access to some of those systems. So if we overclassify, we end up with individuals not being able to see or have access to the information anyway. So it's important that we look at all that holistically. And I think a lot of it comes down to risk management, right? A lot of times we can be very risk averse, and we feel much better just sitting back and saying, look, it's a little risky, as opposed to, let me take a step forward, let me assume the risk, and accept the risk, because that might be what I need to do to move forward.
Great. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. And so I am working on my Yelp rating, and if I don't get to the audience questions, I won't get a good review. So I'm gonna ask for some quick, tight responses to some of these questions. Dennis, this first one is directed at you. And one of our attendees wants to know if there's a report or a summary on your findings of the year-long effort to engage and learn from what academia is doing in OSINT.
Yeah, we have not done, that's actually a great point. We've actually not done kind of a summary of everything that we found. That's
Maybe they will.
Yeah, that's my note. I think I need to go back and do that. I would normally tell my my information person, my technology expert, but she has since departed to go to another more important job. So I will take the note.
Okay.
But I do think it's important. I will tell you that I don't think a lot of folks understand, like I won't specifically point out universities, right? There's one university that has an open source center that is doing some incredible work with industry partners, and it's amazing. There's another one that has an OSINT center that is primarily focused on homeland security. There's, I mean, you name it. I've probably been to 5 or 6 universities that have very specific centers. And so, yeah, it probably would be a good idea for me to do a roll-up of what we found in each of the universities, yeah.
So sort of along that same vein, this next question is, how can universities add programs best to integrate ad tech and OSINT skill sets? Anybody want to take that one?
Ad tech? Mm-hmm. Well, that's specific.
Yeah.
Well, they know some of the powerful data behind open source if they're asking that
Indeed.
question. Yeah. I feel like this is you, Dennis. Dr. Eger.
Here's what yeah, thanks. Now everyone wants to say Dr.
Right.
Eger, right? Yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, I would just say, so what I've found is for that to happen, universities have to have some very specific programs in place, and where they're working with industry partners to do that. And one of them in particular that I have in my mind that I engage with quite frequently, they are doing just that. So, you know, a lot of these companies that are out here, they actually, through some of the training that they do, but that center, they're using these products, and they're teaching their folks in that center how to do those things. So they come out much better prepared. That's why I say they are light years ahead of a lot of the stuff that we're doing, because they're a little freer to be able to do those things, right? And by working with industry, and industry wants them to, you know, a lot of times industry goes to them to test their products and say, test this out for us. Does this work? Can your students use it? What does it look like? Looking at ad tech and some other thing, and it's like, so I think that's kind of like it is absolutely like the nesting kind of training ground for those kinds of things inside of those universities.
Yeah. So whomever asked that question, maybe you can track Dennis down after this, and he'll tell you what university that is. But probably won't.
I will.
Probably
They're
won't
doing amazing things.
You know, I would say that you can work with government partners to set up labs, right? Like there's a number of different processes to establish a lab within a university that focuses, you know, on a specific thing. I will say the name of a university. I know. Ole Miss has the Center for Narrative Intelligence, and they're doing some things kind of on the periphery and in the Venn diagram within OSINT. And they partnered with government to set up the center, and they have a lab, and their students are working inside of this lab. I think this is an example. Don't take it as like an endorsement or
right.
All these universities
Toddy.
each other, and they're great. But yeah, setting up labs, it's a good idea.
I smile because whoever said ad tech, I realized some of you like dialed in immediately and other like eyes glazed. So maybe like to give like a quick 30 second.
Please,
yeah,
Sean.
we had this on our
little
prep
tutorial.
call.
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll be tight. Ad tech, when you guys open your phone and you get those targeted ads, there's a small emission of data of your position, the time, and a little bit about your profile. That is collected by commercial companies. That is the type of data that we're talking about in the context of how this could potentially contribute to mission. Now, to then bring that into the conversation, that skill set translates really well in terms of like cross-functional programs, such as supply chain monitoring, such as understanding how electric signals propagate, right? So think your electrical engineering department. But then there's also a marketing play here. Ad tech actually came out of companies trying to maximize how to be very strategic about how they would selectively target each of us. Some of us might watch a certain show on Netflix and another series might be shopping on Amazon at a specific time. That is the level of data and granularity that is being collected on all of us and is also happening in the reverse order. And so I think when we are empowered to realize that, given that all of this is open knowledge, this is all open source intelligence, I think there are so many ways where you see people's behaviors change now knowing that information.
And also, we do not collect on U.S. persons.
That's right. We do not collect on U.S. persons.
We do not. Emphasize.
So here we have about 8 minutes, I think. So here's another attendee question. What are your thoughts on developing counter AI capabilities against our adversaries and how that could impact OSINT collection analysis? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we have to take that pretty seriously. We should have a concentrated effort on that, but again, it's not one of my big problems. Dennis talked about risk aversion. We talked about professionalizing the OSINT discipline. I think I'll answer that question by asking the audience a question. How many people in this audience think it's a good idea to do OSINT from a sensitive compartmented skiff? That's what we do today. You're the anomaly, and we'll have to talk later. But we really have to kind of rethink everything, and to tie it to the question, it's like there's a spectrum of things that we need to think about. We definitely need to think about that adversarial end of it. We need to think about the mis and disinformation. We need to think about being much more positive, professionalizing this. But we really need to think about how we do that and where we do it very differently than we do it today. We've not solved the problem using the methods that we have today, so why do we think it's going to fix the future for us?
Yeah, I would answer it by saying I think that all the AI that we employ from a friendly perspective to get after all of those things within OSINT, it goes after one of the very first points that I made. It is then you have to use AI to figure out the second and third and fourth order. Like, again, identifying it as one thing. Where is it coming from? What population is it affecting? And then, and only then, can you inject something or use AI to inject something to get after and target that, or target that narrative, or whatever it is that you're looking at. But for us, we've got to be able to identify second, third, fourth order things to then be able to put that in. Because, I mean, if I identify this as misinformation or disinformation, great. Like, what am I going to inject into the system? As opposed to, how do I build something that puts it back at them once I know who I'm targeting? And I think that's really, really important.
So second to last question, it's an attendee question on the ICDC, the IC Data Consortium. If ICDC could remove one or a couple major barriers, what would they be?
Well, we don't have someone on the panel who can speak specifically about ICDC. But what I will say is transparency. So if it helps us build transparency with our vendors, so I don't have to go around, or any particular collection group doesn't have to go around being like, okay, this vendor has this data set and this vendor has this data set, but I'm buying both of these vendors because I need a different data set, but now I'm paying for these specific things. So it's not, oh, we're both buying this from the same vendor. It gets more granular than that, right? And if ICDC can help create an environment where the collectors have the ability to have some more transparency and ease of access, that would be amazing. That will require some trust with industry, okay? Because that's, your trade secrets or your special sauce or tradecraft or whatever it is. Like, it's an ask from industry to come along with us, and there might not be, the huge benefit to you other than to say that you are working alongside national security and you're with us here. Am I saying?
No, I'm laughing because you and I have had this conversation. I remember specifically we were standing on the sidewalk outside of a building talking about how to get after this transparency problem from a vendor perspective, and quite honestly, I mean that is the biggest thing. I know companies, I get it, they built their business on something, but if let's just say the data provider that I have, I need to know what companies essentially they're pulling their data from or incorporating it into that feed that I get. And so that I know what that data is, because then I can compare it to what I need for my mission set. And if I'm already getting it, then I'm good. If not, then I can go to that vendor and say, this is the specific data that I need that is already not coming into my data feed. The problem is, and I get it, companies don't want to talk. They don't want to say, I'm getting this data from that company, or that company saying, look, I'm not going to tell you who gets what on my data because they want me to buy their stuff. I just got to be honest with you, and for everyone that's in here that's a vendor in the tech, that's, news alert, that's not where we're at today. We can't afford that, and that is not where we're going to be in the future. So if I understand, and I'm not trying to tell folks to change their business model, but I'm just telling you, for me, over the next year and a half, and Melisa and I talked about this, I am going to focus heavily on that transparency of what data is coming from what vendor, and I just won't do business with you if I can't figure out where it is, what I'm already getting, and then what I do need from you, right? It's just, we can't afford to do business that way anymore. We just can't. So we talk about looking at change and moving forward. Right. What does that look like in the years to come? This is what it looks like, that transparency, because I can't buy 100 licenses from this company and 100 licenses from this company and 100 from that company when a third of the data is all the same data. I can't afford to do that. So what it's forcing me to do is say, what one company is most beneficial to me, I'm going to buy there, and then I have all the other companies saying we want to buy, and I'm like, sorry, there's no money to do that.
So we have about 3 more minutes, and you answered, I think, already my last question, but I'll see if you have a counter to that. But Sean, we'll start with you first. If you could drive one major change in the next 12 months to strengthen the U.S. advantage in AI-enabled OSINT, what would it be?
Yeah, I would encourage that companies and any research universities that are here today take note of what are existing mission use cases, and you can get a good feel by simply watching the news. And what I found to be so helpful when I was on the government side and now on the AWS side, as I see the priority is enabling mission, it would be if we could figure out how to develop some of this OSINT on low side, similar to Rich's point, offer that back to the government and give them a little bit of a sample, suggesting and framing what you are building or working on as this supports this mission today. This is the data that we have, like, let's have a further discussion. I know it sounds so basic, but I have been somewhat shocked over the past 5 years of how sometimes I'll just get these data calls that are meaningless if they're not anchored in mission. And so making sure that we can frame the value of your research or your work or your product as it pertains to something critical in the next 90 to 120 days, that's often the best way to get foot in the door.
Dennis, your response was super passionate previously, but anything you want to add to that?
I would say, for me, I think over the next 12 months and into the future from a tech perspective is you've got to come to me with a niche capability. Look, I'm sorry to all of you out there that, don't take offense to this, but every vendor comes to me and says, I am the best. I got the best data. I'm the only one in this business. News alert again, you're not the only one in this business, right? So, and I don't mean to break anybody's hearts. I get it, but what I need is niche capabilities. I need you to come to me and tell me what I'm not doing today. And it's not another data feed. It's not. So that's where we got to be. But I would say evolving. I had this conversation with a lot of folks today. 5 years ago when I used to come to these events, if you would walk that hall, it was all bigs, big companies, aircraft, trying to sell aircraft, capabilities in aircraft, you name it. right? Today, it's almost all tech, every bit of it. That's how we're evolving, and that's where we're going. So kudos to all of you, but we need your help.
Rich.
Yeah, I think my answer has already been stated. I think we are now at probably one of the most critical points, I think, in the history of OSINT. And that says a lot because the technology is there, like I said earlier, to answer almost any question we want to put in front of it. The reason we can't answer that question is because we're still hoarding our data. We're not sharing that. If we can feed it the context and we can tell it the question that we want, if we can give it an effective prompt, I promise you we can get almost any answer that we need to get out of that. But it doesn't happen unless we are willing to cross that bridge and figure out a way to make that data accessible.
Melisa, take us home.
Okay. We've talked a lot today about the progress that has been made, and it is huge. We also mentioned, I think it was maybe Dennis that mentioned that some of that progress has been personality dependent. What I would like to see is that the HIPC draft, that it gets through, and that we start codifying some of the radical changes in the ecosystem that are required for sustained change, so that open source is the place where, if you're in Intel, this is where you want to be because it's on the edge, and that professionalization. So I would love to just see a lot of the progress that we have made be codified and then catapulted forward.
Thank you. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thanks so much.